Greetings, Mitch Kishoon here, welcoming you back to this fourth segment of our five-part series on uh, the 400 years of how race and ideas and practices and policies regarding race have affected the chances that people have in the United States of America, restricting opportunities in some cases and expanding opportunities for others. I'm going to start here by calling attention to that 1790 Naturalization Act. I had the text of that up on a slide in a previous segment, didn't really talk too much about it. That this is the first law in the United States that introduces the term white as a concept, as something that has legal meaning. The Naturalization Act of 1790 designated that one had to be a free white person in order to become a naturalized citizen. Well, by the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, this whiteness requirement was raising all sorts of questions about how we define who is white, because who is white determines who can be a citizen. And starting in the late 1800s and into the early 20th century, large numbers of immigrants were coming into the country from places like Italy and Greece and the Middle East, Syria, Turkey, from Japan, from parts of Eastern Europe. There were Slavs and Slovenes and Hungarians and, so a whole melange of people, Russians, Poles. There were people coming into the country who were not Protestants, which was the dominant religion in the United States. There were people coming into the country, many of whom did not speak English. Some of those non-Protestants were Catholics, some were Jews, some had other religions, some were Muslims. So all these questions about who counts as white had to draw upon some of the quote-unquote scientific knowledge that had developed over the 18th and 19th centuries, people like Linnaeus and Cuvier and others who we talked about earlier. In fact, this image on the slide here from a 1906 geography textbook shows the kind of range of nationalities or ethnicities that we begin to see fitting into categories, and they had to figure out, well, where do they fit in this hierarchy? If we have the yellow race, the black race, the red race, and the white race, to use Linnaeus's color-coded system, where do people fit in? Where do Hebrews fit in? Where do Scots Highlanders fit in? Arab Sheikhs. So these are all captions from this image. And Anglo-Saxons, Greeks. And of course, the Japanese and Chinese are there, Native American groups, various groups of people of African descent. So there was a lot of concern about this wave of immigration. There's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in this time period directed against these immigrants who were thought by many to be unassimilable, people who simply couldn't become American. They were too foreign, too different. And they had, in addition, they had different political philosophies in some cases. People who were anarchists or socialists that didn't seem to fit into the kind of governmental system that the United States had developed over the years. So these questions about who could become a citizen become very, very crucial for this whole wave of immigrants. And this next video excerpt that I want to show from the documentary series, Race, the Power of an Illusion, speaks to that. It talks about some of the ways in which these immigrants coming in the early 20th century were viewed by the broader society and some of the fears that were associated with them coming into society. In terms of the way racial thinking worked at the time, different people of different, what we would today call ethnicities, had different racial characteristics, different sort of unchangeable characteristics about their personality and their habits that were seen to be problematic in many cases. I will give you a trigger warning once again for this video excerpt. there are a couple of images of lynching in here. Actually, this time, not the lynching of an African American person, but the lynching of a Jew in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'll let the video explain the context of that. So let's watch this video clip. And I think it's important to think about this idea of whiteness, of who is white. In the 21st century here in the United States, most people think they know who counts as white and who counts as black or who counts as some other race. But just to illustrate how malleable that category of race is, I think it's instructive to look at the way that these immigrants were perceived. And I think this is especially important because a lot of times you hear the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of those immigrants from the early 21st century. And I count myself among them. All four of my grandparents immigrated to the United States between 1890 and 1915 from Italy and Ukraine. And you often hear people with that kind of pedigree saying today, well, look, my ancestors came in and they had all these benefits of American society. They were looked down upon when they came in and they worked hard and built themselves up. So African Americans, for example, should be able to do the same. And in debates about immigration, well, we should shut off immigration. My parents, grandparents, whatever, came in the right way. But at this time, there were no immigration restrictions. Anybody could come in. And I'll talk a little bit about how that changes after this wave of immigration really does transform the United States in some fundamental way. So let's watch the video excerpt, and I'll talk with you again after.
At the start of the 20th century, as millions of immigrants arrived from all over the world, lawmakers and social scientists debated how all of them, including the new European arrivals, would fit into the hierarchy of races already here. They came seeking economic opportunity, freedom, and a future for their families. Of the 23 million newcomers between 1880 and 1920, the vast majority were from Eastern and Southern Europe. Immigrants often work the hardest, poorest paying, and most dangerous jobs, along with the so-called inferior races already here: blacks, Mexicans, and Chinese.
Cities with enormous slums developed as the ugly side of industrialization. Ugly both in terms of the aesthetic of American cities, but also ugly in terms of the solidifying of class differences and class tension. As all of those things became apparent, the immigrant became the symbol for what America might be becoming.
By 1910, 58% of American mining and factory workers were immigrants. Like Mexicans and African Americans, Italians, Slavs, and Jews were often desired as laborers, but also feared, seen as promiscuous, lazy, or stupid. Some saw it as a racial invasion. Charles Davenport, a famous biologist, expressed those fears in 1911. The population of the United States, wrote Davenport, will, on account of the great influx of blood from southeastern Europe, rapidly become darker in pigment, smaller in stature, more given to crimes of larceny, kidnapping, assault, murder, rape, and sexual immorality. And the ratio of insanity in the population will rapidly increase.
And this was also a time when scientific race theory began to take off, and people began to look at society and look at groups of people in more racialized terms. So people were perceived as being separate races. So you had kind of a higher order of white races, which were seen as the Nordics, as opposed to what many of the nativists called the lower races of Europe.
There are various groups like the American Breeders Association, the Eugenics Research Association, who not only are doing research on various racial types, in this case, Hebrews, Slavs, Mediterraneans, what we would call now the Caucasian race, would break it down to 35 or 37 or 45 races for study. And a lot of the language was beginning to get at the idea that those differences were actually rooted in reproduction. They were rooted in heritable traits. They were heritable, they were biological, they were immutable.
The more the newcomers were forced into low-paying jobs and diseased tenements, the more these conditions were explained as natural consequences of their innate racial character. Biology was destiny. Which side of the racial divide you found yourself on could be a matter of life or death. Between 1890 and 1920, 2,500 African Americans were lynched in the South. In 1915, Leo Frank, a Jew living in Atlanta, was pulled from jail and hanged by a mob for allegedly killing a white girl. Writing about the lynching, a black journalist wondered, is the Jew a white man?
Some historians have suggested that these new immigrant groups from Europe were in-between peoples. They were in a transitional stage when compared to Anglo-Saxon Protestants, groups such as Italians or Jews were seen as not being fully white, perhaps. But when compared to African Americans or were compared to Asians, their whiteness became more salient, became more visible.
Could European ethnics become fully white and thus fully American? By 1910, a new term was entering popular culture to describe the transformation of Europeans. The phrase came from the title of a Broadway play by Israel Zangwill. God, said Zangwill, would melt down the races of Europe into a single pure essence, out of which he would mold Americans.
So when the Irish, when Germans, when Italians were coming and they didn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture, the idea was they will assimilate into Americanhood. They will become American, which in the American tradition has meant white American. But that melting pot never included people of color. Blacks, Chinese, Puerto Ricans, etc. could not melt into the pot. They could be used as wood to produce the fire for the pot, but they could not be used as material to be melted into the pot.
Whiteness was key to citizenship. In 1790, Congress had passed an act declaring that only free white immigrants could become naturalized citizens. After the Civil War, naturalization was extended to persons of African descent as well. But it was the white citizen who had clear access to the vote, sat on juries, was elected to public office, and had better jobs. Whiteness was not simply a matter of skin color. To be white was to gain the full rewards of American citizenship.
In order to be a naturalized citizen in this country, you had to be categorized as white or black. And almost everybody who tried to naturalize, all but I think one case that went to the Supreme Court, all of them were people trying to be categorized as white. So the court had to make decisions about who was white and who was not.
Courts and legislators had long been in the business of conferring racial identities. In the South, to enforce Jim Crow segregation and laws against mixed marriages, courts had to first determine who was black under law.
And here's where it really gets interesting. You got some places, for example, Virginia law defined a black person as a person with 1/16th African ancestry. Now, Florida defined a black person as a person with 1/8 African ancestry. Now, Alabama said, you're black if you got any black ancestry, any African ancestry at all. But you know what this means? You can walk across a state line and literally, legally change race. Now, what does race mean under those circumstances? You give me the power, I can make you any race I want you to be, because it is a social, political construction.
In 1909, American courts had that power. That year, the U.S. Court of Appeals in Massachusetts ruled that Armenians, often classified as Asiatic Turks, were legally white. If Armenians could be designated white, what of the other so-called Asiatic races? Filipinos, Syrians, the Japanese. Could they also petition successfully to be designated white by the courts and thus become Americans?
So I think you can see how malleable that concept of race becomes by this time period. And the comment about how a person of African descent, of some degree of African descent, can be labeled one thing or another, one race or another, depending on what state they are in. What whether it's Alabama or Florida or Georgia or other states had different kinds of laws defining who was white according to degrees of African ancestry. And of course, all these the American courts had to deal with questions of people from these various parts of the world, whether it's the Middle East or Eastern Europe or Russia or parts of Africa, parts of Asia, to determine whether or not they were white. And here on this slide, you can see just a handful, just a few of the cases. There are many, many, many cases that were working their way through the American courts, some of them making it all the way to the Supreme Court. As with the one that's listed at the bottom here, a man from India, Bhagat Singh Thind, was a very famous case in which the courts used a lot of different kinds of logics to determine who fit into what racial category. Sometimes it was relying on those so-called scientists like Linnaeus and Cuvier and others who came after them, or on these geography textbooks. Some of them actually referred to specific geography textbooks for their discussions of what race a particular group fell into. So in some cases, they relied on court precedent, what previous courts had decided about Syrians or Armenians or Japanese or whoever it might be. Sometimes they relied on science. Sometimes they relied on that court's interpretation of what the intent was of Congress in laying out these ideas about race. In some cases, and the Thind case is a good example of this, is that the courts decided that they were going to use the logic of what the common man determined was race. That the idea is that the man on the street, the common man, knew what a white person was when they looked at a white person, and all these other things, whether it's science or precedent or the intent of Congress, didn't really matter. So basically, the idea there is race is what we say it is, and does that change over time? It's a really messy thing, and it shows how ridiculous it was to try to enforce these kinds of ideas about racial categories, about who is white. And it could work in a lot of different ways, and sometimes these different systems of court precedent and common sense and scientific theory were in conflict with one another. So we're going to move on from here and talk about some of the ways that this connects with the history of African Americans in this time period and moving forward. Because just as large numbers of people from different parts of Europe and Asia were coming into the United States seeking citizenship, there were also significant numbers of African Americans within the United States who used migration as a mechanism for which to improve their own condition. So we're going to move on to the next slide. And the rest of these slides in this section are going to have some information, and I'm going to provide a little bit of context and narration and to try to set up where we are in terms of racial thinking and in terms of African American status in American society by the mid-20th century. One thing that happened in American society in the 1920s with regard to immigration from outside the country was a couple of laws that were passed in 1921 and 1924. The 1924 Immigration Act was the one that really had the biggest impact. It severely restricted immigration from particular countries. And it really limited the ability of people from the Middle East, from Southern and Eastern Europe, to come into the country. There was so much concern, so much fear of those immigrants, whether it was because of, for political reasons, that they feared the, the entry of communist or socialist or anarchist political ideas, or whether it was fears of race. They didn't want these so-called inferior races like Jews and Slavs and Armenians and Asian Indians or what have you coming into the country. This 1924 Act pretty much shut off that large wave of immigration from Europe. It was partially shut off by World War I. Talk about that in a moment. But it was also shut off by this Immigration Act, and we'll see that does not change for several decades, that the United States doesn't open up its borders again. I'm not really going to visit those changes in immigration law. We're going to shift our focus back to African Americans, because part of the context here is while the United States could shut off immigration from outside the country by using these various laws and mechanisms, it was much more difficult, if not impossible, to really control migrations within the country. And African Americans certainly voted with their feet, even those in the South who were restricted from actually voting in the political process, by migrating north. And there's a context for this. And you can see on this slide a number of the push-pull factors that affected what we have typically referred to as the Great Migration. This Great Migration brought millions of African Americans out of the South into other parts of the country, the Northeast, the Midwest, the Far West, in the decades between 1910 and 1960. It came in two waves. The first wave began during World War II and continued through the 1920s. There was somewhat of a hiatus in the numbers of migrants coming out of the South, Black migrants coming out of the South during the years of the Depression in the 1930s. But World War II stimulated another large wave of African American migration out of the South into the North, Midwest, and Far West. These movements had profound changes, not only for African Americans who were migrating and those left behind, but for the broader American culture as a whole. And you can see sociologists, scholars studying migration often talk about push factors, what's causing a person or a family to leave a particular place, and pull factors, what attracts them to migrate to a particular location. So there are a number of things that all come together here in the 1910s. There were some economic problems in the South, agricultural problems. Flooding was a problem. Droughts were a problem in different seasons. The boll weevil attacked cotton plants and did severe damage. So the cotton economy was really hit hard by this combination of environmental factors. And as is typically the case in the American economy, African Americans felt the brunt of this worse than other groups in American society. So that was one reason to get out of the South. They simply couldn't make a living to the extent that they could before in cotton agriculture. The other big factor, another big factor, is the hardening of Jim Crow and the escalation of racial violence. And we can see this happening with the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1910s. And we see this with the rise of lynching, with changes in American laws in this time period that really restrict the rights of African Americans and really unleash a wave of violence the first 2 decades of the 20th century. That was extremely disheartening, to say the least. It was a tragic era in this country. So there are a lot of reasons for blacks to leave the South. They couldn't vote, they couldn't get education for their children, they couldn't get decent jobs, they couldn't get decent education for themselves, and there was always that constant threat of violence. In terms of what attracted them to the North, well, getting out of the South, you go to places that were most convenient. Because of World War I, the migration from Europe was shut off. All those European immigrants that were coming in and taking those low-skill manual labor jobs in meatpacking and steel mills and all the other industries that were very prominent in the North. They weren't coming in, and the United States was ramping up its production to help feed its allies in World War I with material goods and support. So northern manufacturers are recruiting African Americans to come up from the South to work in those meatpacking plants and those steel mills and those coal mines and all those other things that were necessary for this industrial economy. Black newspapers were urging blacks to leave the South and come north because they saw there was opportunity. They had voting rights in the North. They had year-round school for their children when children's education was severely restricted in the South. There were higher wages. There were modern conveniences. There were vibrant black communities in places like the south side of Chicago and Harlem. This is the age when Harlem really exploded with an African-American population. It hadn't been a black area before. So you had all kinds of cultural activity, political activity, intellectual activity, artistic activity among African Americans in these northern cities. And also, family members who had migrated earlier would send back reports. Yeah, hey, I can get you a job here. Come and live with me in my apartment. We have running water. We have a stove. Things that were not really available for African Americans in much of the South. I want you to take some time to look through the next several slides. There's no video on those slides. There's just some information there, but just to help you think about that some of the impact of this first wave of African American migration out of the South between roughly 1915 and 1930, or I guess 1940. I want you to think about this movement of a people who were overwhelmingly rural and agricultural in their orientation, coming into a big part of the reason they came north was for industrial jobs. And whether it was in a big city like Chicago or Cleveland or Pittsburgh, or if it was in a smaller manufacturing community like Muskegon, Michigan, there were different kinds of jobs available in different places. So these rural agricultural people become a more urbanized people and a more industrial people in terms of the kind of work they were doing. The map that's on one of the pages coming up for the first wave of migration shows this with arrows the sort of direction of most migrants. Not everybody followed these particular paths, but these roughly correspond with where the train lines run. This was a major mode of transportation, and as the train routes are coming out of the southeast, going north along the Atlantic seaboard into places like Philadelphia and New York, in the farther west, you have the train lines going up into through Kansas City and St. Louis and Chicago, and in between you have train lines going up through Kentucky and into places in Ohio and Pennsylvania. So you have these different sort of tracks that bring people from particular regions in the South into particular areas in the North, but they don't stay put then either. Sometimes they'll follow family members from one northern community to another. They'll find what works best for them. And I also want to point out some of the benefits that the Blacks found in the North, and also some of the continued subordination and lack of opportunity they found in the North. This was not a perfect racial world they found in the North. There was deep-seated racial prejudice in the North. They typically did not face the levels of day-to-day violence that they faced in the South, but there was violence along race lines. But they could make a better living. They had better opportunities for their children. They had more active Black communities. They had political empowerment. The right to vote is something that you really have to think about as having a significant impact on the way 20th century, mid-20th century politics took shape in the United States. When African-American communities in the North grow larger and larger, these people can vote. They have a political voice that white politicians need to pay attention to if they want to get those votes and win those elections. So African Americans become significant, and white politicians need to pay some attention, finally, to some of the problems that African Americans are facing and being vocal about. There's increasing activism because of this concentration of intellectual and political and activist power in these urban Black communities. But at the same time, these people are forced into ghettos by sometimes laws, sometimes just shady real estate practices. But you have these ghettos develop, and I think I have some listed on one slide: the South Side of Chicago, the Hill District in Pittsburgh, of course Harlem in New York, the Black Bottom in Detroit. Every major industrial city had a particular part of town where Blacks were restricted and paid very high rents and had very limited city services. And there were high rates of unemployment. There were high rates of crime and vice, and largely because of this concentration of people in a small area who really had no other options. They could only live in these areas. They were restricted from living in any other area, even if they could afford it. But again, these ghettos did bring some positive elements of forming Black communities, of having a vibrant cultural life, intellectual life, and activist life and political life in a way that wasn't possible in the South. So please take some time to look through these next several slides, get a sense of the geography, get a sense of some of the pros and cons that came with the migration north. And I'll join you after you've had a little opportunity to do that in the next slide, where there is a video clip. Okay, so those previous slides that you just looked through give some sense of the geography and some sense of the impact that this black migration out of the South had on some particular cities. That one chart that shows the dramatic increase in black population between 1900 and 1940. Some of these cities have very large jumps in the black population. But it's important to keep in mind that even in places like Detroit, that saw hundreds of thousands more African Americans moving into Detroit up to 1940, the black population of Detroit, percentage-wise, was still in the single digits. Detroit, and this is true of the other cities as well, they were predominantly white cities, overwhelmingly white cities, however we define white in this in this context. So when you think about this urbanization of the black population moving out of the rural South and sometimes out of the urban South into the industrial cities and small towns of the North, while it's a significant increase in black population and has a significant impact in those communities, the black population is still very small compared to the amount of number of African Americans still living in the South. Still more than half of the black population of the United States lived in the South by 1940, and really that doesn't change until 1960 when it's about 50-50. So really the concentration of the African American population is still in those states of the former Confederacy. But many, of course, did move out to find those greater opportunities to get away from lynch law and the restrictions of Jim Crow. But there were still restrictions in the North. There were restaurants that blacks couldn't eat in and hotels they couldn't stay in, and they could ride on public transportation and sit wherever they wanted. But there are certain parts of town and certain towns that they could not enter. The phenomenon that is known as sundown towns in which it was widely known by blacks and whites alike that African Americans should not show their faces in this town after dark if they wanted to avoid any harm coming to them. So this was happening in northern cities and towns as well as southern ones. So again, the North was not some kind of racial utopia that African Americans found, but they did find some advantages there that they did take advantage of in order to find a voice in American society and American politics. Some of the images I have on this page represent what I suggested earlier, that it's not just that the migration had an impact on the lives of African Americans, it had an impact on the broader society, especially when considered in conjunction with all the other changes happening in this time period. And one of those big changes was technological. The advent of radio in the 1920s, motion pictures, really a couple decades before that, but the motion picture industry really expanded in the 1920s and 1930s. You have what really we could for the first time talk about mass culture in the United States. As radio developed in the 1920s and 30s, you had syndicated national radio broadcasting programs from major broadcasters, the Columbia Broadcasting Systems and the National Broadcasting National Broadcasting Corporation, NBC and CBS, we know them as today. They begin with radio syndication, and some of these shows were heard if you had electricity, whether you were in New York City or Los Angeles or Denver or Austin, Texas. As long as you had electricity and a radio, you had access to the same programs that everyone else around the country was listening to. There was local programming, of course, as well, and there was some specialized programming along racial or ethnic lines. There were Yiddish radio stations broadcasting. There were few radio stations that catered specifically to African American audiences. This happens more later on. But in the 20s and 30s, you had people for the first time being able to get the same news, the same entertainment programs coming across the radio waves for people all over the country. Movies operated in much the same way. When there was a blockbuster movie coming out of Hollywood, everyone got to see it. Any town that had a movie theater was going to get those big national movies. And in this way, there was increasingly a shared culture in a way that prior technologies simply couldn't accommodate. And African Americans were a big part of this culture. One other element of it is the phonograph that was really developed through the 1910s and 20s to become a mass marketed product. And this is the era when, the 1920s, often referred to as the jazz age. African American ragtime, blues, and jazz musicians in particular begin to attract a national audience. Record producers recognize that these types of songs are becoming very popular and they sell. Lots of African American artists are recording in the 1920s and 1930s. But very often they're being exploited by white producers and not really gaining financially to the extent that they should have for their recordings. But people like, you can see represented here, Ma Rainey and Duke Ellington become nationally known because of those records and because of radio airplay. So in this way, Black culture is being broadcast to the nation in a way that it hadn't been before. Blacks using their own voices through music and through literature and through the visual arts. Here we see a volume, the cover of Langston Hughes' poem, The Weary Blues. Langston Hughes came into his own as a poet in the 20s and 30s. And again, his works were published by mainstream publishers. This is happening for lots of other African American poets and novelists, and to a certain extent visual artists as well, and essayists. Black politics is also becoming national. The NAACP has a national platform with its magazine, The Crisis, which was edited by the prominent Black activist and scholar W.E.B. Du Bois. So his word is spreading throughout the nation among at least progressive communities who are interested in reading The Crisis. There were a number of Black political organizations, including Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. You see an image of Garvey here on this page as well. Styles of dance are being spread. A lot of the things that we recognize as the dances of the swing era emerge out of African American communities, where there was a dance like the Black Bottom or the Charleston, the Lindy Hop. These things were invented in Black communities during the ragtime era and into the 20s, and adopted and adapted by whites across the nation. You could say the same thing for jazz music and blues music as whites start to be attracted to these kinds of sounds. Blues had a very significant influence and impact on country music's development, for example. So there's all kinds of ways in which Black culture becomes nationalized, and that white Americans have access to these Black artistic and creative voices in a way that they hadn't before. And that's a big impact for American society. I think that it bears considering in terms of how much of our American culture really has emerged from African American cultural expression. And going on to the next slide, I want to talk about the second wave of migration a little bit. The first wave of migration of Blacks out of the South into those manufacturing cities came largely because of World War I, or at least in part because of World War I, and the demand for labor in those industrial factories and the act of recruiting in the South to get Black workers to come north. And this happened in World War II era as well. And increasingly, the manufacturing was scaled up. This was a war in which the United States entered relatively early compared to its very late entry into World War I. So by 1940, the U.S. is not quite in the war yet, but with the Lend-Lease program of the United States supplying Great Britain with a lot of materiel and equipment, the U.S. manufacturing industry is ramping up, and African Americans are having some degree of access to those industrial jobs in shipyards, jobs in steel plants, jobs in the automotive plants in Detroit that are shifted over to making tanks and other military equipment. All along the West Coast, from Seattle down to San Diego, there are naval bases and naval construction industry related to naval defense industries. So African Americans have lots of opportunities in these other areas. Another thing to remember about both the first and second wave of migration, and this is significant in understanding some of the conflicts that emerge as blacks migrate in large numbers into northern and western cities, is that whites were migrating out of the South as well. Poor white farmers were hit hard by the boll weevil in the 1910s. They were hit by the floods. They were hurting in terms of the cotton economy having fallen apart then. The attraction of these jobs in industrial plants during World War I era and World War II era were very appealing to white Southerners as well as black Southerners. So white Southerners migrating into these communities are going to face similar kinds of issues. They're not going to face the kinds of racial segregation and violence and Jim Crowing that black migrants faced, but they are going to face new workplaces, new living environments, new communities with different kinds of people in them, and housing shortages in which more and more people are coming into these manufacturing communities, and they can't build housing fast enough. So things get very cramped and very tense, and issues of racial segregation as African Americans want to move out of cities becomes very heated. So we'll see more about that in the next segment here, but I just want to call attention to that, the fact that Southern white migrants are coming as well as Southern black migrants. So I'll join you in the next slide and talk a bit more about some of these developments and try to pull some things together. These two graphs on the left side of the slide suggest some of the broad patterns of black migration in the period, even before the 20th century. But you can see that top graph showing the decline of African Americans living in the South, and as I said, it gets by 1960 or so, it gets to be about 50-50, and it's interesting what you see after about 1960 and certainly after 1970. You begin to see an increase again of the number of African Americans living in the South. And this reflects a reverse migration where many of the black Americans who had moved out of the South in the middle decades of the century, after 1970, either they or their children and grandchildren or both or all of them begin to migrate back into the South for a variety of reasons. A lot of those people who have migrated themselves have retired by the 1960s from whatever a decent union job they may have had, and living is cheaper in the South. A lot of black families still had connections in the South with family members who remained behind. The cost of living is lower. The climate is milder than in the harsh winters of the North, and there's a certain familiarity that was maintained in terms of Southern African American cultural traditions that draw African Americans back to the South after the end of the 1960s, and that's in part reflecting some of the gains of the civil rights movement. That life in the South for African Americans after the 1970s was not quite as dangerous as it had been during the Jim Crow era, and that allows people some flexibility in moving back to the South. The bottom graph gives a sense of the migration out of the South and how it changed from decade to decade. As I suggested, there was a bit of a slump in the 1930s as people everywhere across the country were scrambling to put food on the table and a roof over their families' heads during the Great Depression. Very clearly in the 1910s and 20s, and then again in the 1940s and 50s, you see reflected in those big, especially in the 40s and 50s, these big spikes in migration. That's the draw of those defense industry jobs, and the post-World War II period, as the civil rights movement in the 1950s is starting to pick up a little bit of momentum. African Americans are seeking opportunities wherever they can, and a lot of times this involves being out of the South. where there were increasingly unionized jobs and unions were beginning to accept African Americans as members, where previously they had been excluded from most labor unions. This gives some of the sort of overview of some of the shifts in Black population movement. And again, I'll emphasize that white Southerners were also migrating out of the South in the middle decades of the 20th, early to middle decades of the 20th century, in order to seek economic opportunity that wasn't available for them. And their presence in northern communities, along with the presence of numerous Black Southerners in those communities, created more tension than there might have been otherwise. Obviously, whites coming from the South had particular views about how race relations were supposed to work, with Blacks in a subordinate position, Blacks not living among whites, really to any great degree, unless they were servants and subservient to whites. They did not like the realities of mixed groups in streetcars. Lots of restaurants and other kinds of public facilities did include African Americans without any restrictions, although plenty still did. So white Southerners are very resistant to have any kind of progressive attitude toward racial mixing, toward African Americans having expanded opportunities, toward African Americans not being in a subordinate position, a subservient position in American society. And this does lead to conflict specifically over jobs and over housing. And we see this in community after community across the country, where whites claim certain jobs as their own. They don't want Blacks living in their communities. This is true of northern whites as well as the southern white migrants who are coming into these communities. But that kind of resistance to African Americans having equal access to housing, decent housing, outside of those racially restrictive ghetto areas that these most northern communities that had a Black population did develop during the course of the 20th century. That struggle over living space and over opportunity and over the ideas of whether African Americans should have equal access to these same opportunities in American society creates conflict, and the government of the United States doesn't really help. This is the end of this segment of the 5-part series. The final segment coming up next is going to explore some of those issues over housing and the impact that it has in shaping the opportunities African Americans have or do not have in American society, north, south, west, and otherwise. And it'll explore the connection between opportunities of housing and the impact of racial segregation on the accumulation of wealth, the opportunities for education, the opportunities for employment as the post-World War II era emerges and significant problems develop with regard to deindustrialization and the impact of deindustrialization and suburbanization on African American communities who often do not have access to the same opportunities that white Americans have. So we'll pick this up in segment 5, the final segment of our series.